Hello, Sol Solaire here. The theoretical physicist that's written the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness, and this is part 2 of Typical Objections Refuted. So, yeah, my theory and my principles as I present them, people make objections, and the objections are very similar. There's just a small set of the same objections repeated again and again. So going through those and refuting them. So in part 1, I talked mainly about the psychological issues with the theory. In that, as I said in that lecture, this theory requires a large reconceptualization of the universe that you live in, and it takes some time and some open-mindedness and some careful reflection, and to come to terms with this theory. And at first it's quite shocking, and I suppose it's quite a lot to come to terms with, because, as I said, you're going from conceiving of the universe you live in as this cold, dead, unfeeling thing to a thing and a conscious entity composed entirely of physical consciousness, including your physico-conscious self. So yeah, I've written down, but the first part was kind of just a discussion, and it was a little bit rambling, so I've written down a few objections here that I want to refute one by one. So the first two I wrote are, "This is impossible," and "This is not scientific." So I think I addressed those objections in the first part. And then I guess I'll read them all out first, all the objections that I'm going to cover today. So "This is impossible," "This is not scientific." Number 3, "There is no evidence that things like electrons are conscious." That's another typical, that there's no scientific evidence for this consciousness that I'm talking about. It's a very common objection. Number 4, "No new maths." That troubles some people. They think, oh, this is a new theory of consciousness, new scientific theory. There should be new maths. There should be new equations. There is one new equation. That equation is the simplest equation ever written in physics, actually, because it's the simplest type of mathematical equation, and that is E equals C. That's the new equation. That's the fundamental equation of this theory. E, capital E, energy, equals capital C, consciousness. Okay. That's not to be confused with the C from E equals mc squared, which, as I'm sure you know, represents the speed of light in a vacuum. And also, capital C is used for other things like capacitance, and I think. But, letters are regularly used to symbolize more than one physical entity or phenomena. So I think it's fine to say E equals C, where capital C is consciousness. Physical energy is exactly equal to physical consciousness. It can be experienced in 2 ways. Objectively, that's when you look at something that isn't you, and to analyze things objectively we use conventional objective physics. But then physical energy can also be experienced subjectively, and it can only be experienced subjectively by the energy itself. So there's subjective experience within all energy that can only be experienced by the energy itself. So you can only experience your subjective consciousness within your physical self. You can't see anyone else's subjective consciousness. No new maths, yeah. So there is no new maths except for E equals C. Okay, so those are 4 objections that I'd like to cover now today. And then I will talk about some facts in favor of my theory. I might talk a little bit about localism, because one person online didn't quite understand localism. And then, yeah, okay. So this is not scientific, this is impossible. No, those are just reflexive reactions to a very new idea. Those aren't actually logical or scientific objections at all. As I said in the last lecture, everything in our universe, everything that has physical existence, is formed out of physical energy, is some form of physical energy. And that physical energy could possess, there's nothing unscientific about or impossible about one of the fundamental intrinsic properties of energy being consciousness. That's not an unscientific postulate, and it's not impossible. In fact, as you know, you're made out of nothing but energy and particles, and you're intrinsically conscious. So it makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense of the fact that you interact with purely physical things like light, chemicals, things like that, and they change, alter you have conscious interactions with those things. They alter your conscious state, which makes a lot of sense if it's consciousness interacting with consciousness, physical consciousness having physical interactions with other forms of physical consciousness. Okay, so it is possible, it is scientific, and we know it's correct because we can actually finally construct a physics of consciousness based on this postulate. And it's the only postulate, after 100 years of endeavor, it's the only postulate that does allow for a sensible scientific theory that does logically solve the hard problem of consciousness. Okay, there is no evidence that things like electrons are conscious. That's a very common objection. But we need to be clear. We need to clarify this objection. Because there is some evidence that things like electrons are conscious, but it's a particular type of evidence. So to be clear, when a person objects with this objection, what they actually mean is there is no objective evidence that things like electrons are conscious. That's true. There is no objective evidence that something like an electron is conscious. True. But there is also no objective evidence for any consciousness whatsoever. There is no objective evidence that any other human is conscious, or that any human is conscious, or any dog, or any horse, or anything whatsoever. There is no objective evidence for consciousness whatsoever. We never ever see any conscious experience when we look objectively at formations of energy. So, and yet we do suspect and believe that consciousness exists. Why? Because we are all experiencing consciousness. You need to be conscious to be a scientist, to reflect on things and to study things, and you need to be conscious to come up with a theory of consciousness. So all scientists who study consciousness obviously believe that consciousness exists, because they're trying to come up with theories about it. And obviously you don't try and come up with a theory about something that you don't believe exists in the first place. So yeah, there is no objective evidence that things like electrons exist, because there's no objective evidence of any consciousness whatsoever. And we have to accept that as philosophers and scientists. We just have to accept that that's the way our universe is. Consciousness cannot be observed objectively, and we have to move on from there. After accepting that fact, then we have to move on and make a scientific theory that accepts that fact and contends with that fact. And okay, so is there any evidence for consciousness? Yes, there is subjective evidence for consciousness, and that is right now you are conscious. You are subjectively experiencing your consciousness, and you have done throughout your whole life. And that's your only evidence for subjective consciousness. Well, actually, that's not true. That's your only direct. The only way for you to directly observe subjective consciousness is to observe your own subjective consciousness. Okay. Then, is there any other evidence for consciousness? Yes, you can look around you and look at other formations of energy, and you can observe their behavior. You objectively observe their behavior, and their behavior can convince you that they are conscious. So objective observations of behavior can convince you of the existence of consciousness apart from your own. So you look at someone and you look at the way they move, what they do, the way they act, the way their face moves, their actions and behaviors, and the things that they say to you, for example, as well. And you're like, okay, the way this person behaves, it's as if they're conscious within themselves, just the way I'm conscious within myself. So that's how you believe that your mom, your dad, your friends and family are conscious, and your dog or what have you. Your dog has eyes, and your dog can yawn, and when your dog yawns, you're like, okay, I suppose he's consciously feeling tired within himself. At least that's what you'll say. You'll say, oh, look, he's tired. When he hovers around the dog bowl, and the dog bowl is empty, then you'll say, okay, he's hovering around the dog bowl, I guess he's hungry. And you can imagine he has a stomach. If you cut him open, you'll find a stomach connected to his brain, and you can imagine that he has the same feelings within his little stomach of hunger that you have, okay? But you can't objectively prove, you can never, ever objectively prove that he's conscious. It's just an impossibility within our universe. Because we have dissected humans and animals, and we've dissected them while they're alive, and we don't see their conscious experience. We just see the objective manifestation of their physical selves. We don't see the subjective manifestation, which takes place within themselves, because it is the energy that they are formed out of. Because the energy that they're formed out of is actually physical consciousness. And physical consciousness can take on many different forms, and those different forms have different conscious experiences within themselves. Okay, so yeah, there is no objective evidence that things like electrons are conscious. But we can observe things carefully and suppose, oh look, this looks like conscious behavior. And that's where we can believe that electrons, protons and neutrons and atoms and molecules are conscious. Because we can observe their behavior, which quantum physicists did in all the quantum mechanical experiments. And the best way of explaining, once we carefully examine the behavior of things like electrons, the best way of explaining their behavior, because that's what an experiment is. You take an electron, you put it in some sort of scenario, and you see how it behaves in that scenario. You put it through a magnetic field, for example. And you see, how does this particle behave when it's in a magnetic field? So you're observing its behavior, and just like you can look at the behavior of a human or a dog and say, oh, its behavior strongly suggests to me and convinces me that it's conscious, we can look at the experiments of quantum mechanics, and the best explanation for the behavior that we witness in quantum mechanics is that the particles are intrinsically conscious. Okay? So by carefully observing other physical entities, we can decide, we can become convinced based on their behavior. The most logical explanation for their behavior is that they are conscious. And that is the most logical, I won't go into that now, because as I keep saying, there's a lecture on this channel called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, where I show that the best way of interpreting the experiments of quantum mechanics is to assume that E equals C, energy equals consciousness, and that each quantum particle or quantum atom or molecule is an individual conscious entity with some perception of their local universe and the ability to choose from limited sets of future possible states. Okay, and that's, quantum mechanics has been around for 100 years with no satisfactory, simple, logical and intuitive interpretation. But once we assume E equals C, we get a simple, logical and intuitive interpretation. Which is evidence of my theory. Like, what I'm trying to explain to people now is how you come to form scientific belief. Nothing is ever proved for certain and eternally. You just, what science and physics is an attempt at an explanation and a mathematical, approximate mathematical models, and you believe in particular theories and models if they have wide-ranging explanatory power. And my theory is the only theory with wide-ranging explanatory power. In fact, there is no other theory that has any explanatory power whatsoever. You can check. Go and find a theory of consciousness, an emergent one, for example, or even another panpsychic one that just makes clear and simple sense and that can be used to form models and explain a wide range of phenomena. So just to recap, my theory solves the hard problem of consciousness very simply and logically. It gives the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, and it can be used to construct models of physico-conscious systems, such as human eyesight, human taste, things like that, muscle movement, touch, all those types of things. We can make models now. And it also aligns perfectly, the interpretation of quantum mechanics also aligns perfectly with our daily, everyday experience of being conscious entities. And of course, you must remember our only evidence for subjective consciousness, our only evidence for consciousness is our own conscious experience. So we do need a theory that aligns and makes sense of our own conscious experience. Okay, so I think that's covered. So there is evidence that electrons are conscious. It's just not objective evidence. You can't objectively see their consciousness, but you can carefully study their behavior. And if you carefully study it, it becomes clear that it's the result of an electron being an intrinsically conscious entity that makes choices for itself. A very, very simple conscious entity. And then these entities, these electrons and things, protons and neutrons, can bond into more and more complex forms. And after 14 billion years of evolution, they've evolved into forms as complex as humans, such as yourself. And because it's such a complex configuration, it has a very complex conscious experience within itself. So your conscious experience is very complex as a human. But that's taken 14 years of conscious evolution, 14 billion years to evolve such complex configurations. Okay. And yeah, but everything is conscious. The air is conscious, but the air is conscious in the sense that all the molecules and energy that is composed out of this are individually conscious. Every air molecule is conscious. Every oxygen molecule is an individual conscious entity. So it doesn't mean that, and when you form electrons and molecules and atoms into a chair, for example, it doesn't mean that they form into some sort of special chair consciousness. No, it's just that each individual atom is conscious and forms into, and they've bound together into a chair, into that form, which would change their conscious state. An electron within a chair will have a very different conscious experience than an electron in free space. But it's not having some sort of I'm a chair experience. It's bound, it feels bound within, when an electron is in free space, it has the experience of whizzing through space. And it will feel whatever, if it goes into a magnetic field or if it goes into a gravitational field, it will feel the forces of those fields. That would be one type of conscious experience an electron can have. Then it could have another experience when it bonds to an atom and then winds up in a chair. It will have, an experience of vibrating within that chair, and that experience will change depending on the ambient temperature, how much energy it has within itself, thermal energy. But these conscious experiences will be extremely simple. Okay. Because they're such simple configurations. Humans, on the other hand, on Earth, we've evolved these very complex conscious technologies that we call central nervous systems and brains. And the central nervous system, just as the name suggests, gives rise to a center of consciousness. So you have consciousness throughout your entire body, but there's kind of your central nervous system kind of, what's the word? Well, centralizes conscious impressions from throughout your body into one central conscious experience, which is why you have experiences of coming from every part of your body at the same time. As in, you can have an itchy foot at the same time as you're listening to music. So you're getting conscious impressions via your central nervous system. You're getting conscious impressions of the itchiness in your foot being transmitted to transmitted to your center of consciousness, and at the same time you're getting conscious impressions from your, from your ear as well. And these get centralized by your central nervous system. So within your center of consciousness, you have both experiences at the same time. And obviously, it can be more than just two experiences. Okay. These models, they need a lot of work, a lot of expansion. We need a lot more detail, and we need to work out the details of how time is experienced as well, which is I haven't worked out all those details yet, to be totally honest, but I'm working on them, and it's coming slowly but surely. Okay. Because obviously the human body and brain and the central nervous system are a very complex system indeed. Okay, so the next objection, no new maths. So we have this new theory, new physics. Why is there no new maths? Which is a good question. Well, basically all the maths has been done. We have the experiments of quantum mechanics. See, what physics is, we do experiments, we have experience of the universe around us, and then we construct mathematical models. Because maths has geometry, which is, I'm sure you know what geometry is, grids that you can use to map onto physical space. And then we also have calculus, which describes how things move through space. Calculus is the rate of change, measuring rates of change, how things change with time. So you combine geometry with calculus, which is exactly what Newton did. First of all, he had to invent calculus, which was pretty impressive, and then he combined it with geometry. So before that, all geometry was static. Euclid came up with his geometry, but it was all just lines and squares and triangles and circles. But the circles and squares that Euclid described, they never moved. They couldn't get bigger or move through space. There was no movement. For movement in geometry, you need calculus. Because calculus is the mathematical way of describing how things change with time. And movement is change with time. It's the change of position with time. So you need calculus first. But Newton combined geometry with calculus to come up with mathematical physics. But then you can see it's only the physics of movement, how things move. So that's what conventional physics is. Descriptions of how things move. Then you have chemistry and atomic physics. And that's how physical things bind together. The bonds that can be made between objects. So that's how energy binds together, how energy and particles bind together to form physical objects. But you can see how that's all totally objective. Consciousness doesn't figure anywhere. We just have mathematical descriptions of how physical objects move through space and time. And we have mathematical descriptions of how atoms and molecules bind together into physical forms. And we have mathematical descriptions of how light is emitted and all these various things. And so what objective conventional physics has done is to construct and develop a very wide-ranging and very accurate mathematical description of our universe. But it's a mathematical description only of the objective aspects of our universe, okay? That is how physical objects are formed, and then how they move through space, and how they interact with each other physically, how they bounce off one another, collide, etc. All those types of things. And you can see that there's no consciousness anywhere, okay? So where Newton combined philosophy and maths, and combined geometry and calculus to make mathematical physics, what I'm doing is taking conventional physics, Newtonian physics, and the physics of Einstein as well, and quantum mechanics, and I'm combining them with consciousness and our subjective study of consciousness. So the mathematical description of the physical forms of our universe is there. It exists. That's conventional objective physics. That's the mathematical description. And it's a very detailed and elaborate mathematical model of our universe. The forms that the energy, the basic energy of our universe can take on, and how those forms can move through space. So it's a very detailed and elaborate mathematical map. And again, you must remember it's an approximate map. It's not an eternal and perfect map. It will require modification. We will probably always be modifying this map. All of our physical knowledge is provisional. And so what I'm doing in the physics of consciousness is adding subjectivity to this map. So, and we have, and because the only subjective experience any of us ever experience is our own, it has to start with human conscious experience first. So it's all by way of analogy with our own conscious experience. Okay, so what neuroscientists are doing is they're constructing physical, objective maps of our brains and our bodies. And then we know, through experience, what type of subjective conscious experiences we have within those forms. And then we can start deducing what types of conscious experience other forms have, such as a dog. So we can look at a dog and it has eyes just like ours, and we can look at its eyes, dissect its brain, and we can say, oh, it's very similar to our brain and our eyes, so it's having visual conscious experience just like we are. And then what we can do is look at the way their eyes are different to our eyes, and the way their brains are different to our eyes. And then we can say, oh look, we can examine the rods and cones of its retinas and see what wavelengths of light they're sensitive to. And then we can see, oh, dogs don't have exactly the same visual conscious experience as us. They see in a different range of wavelengths of light than us. So then what we've done is we've used our objective study of the construction of a dog's eyes to work out, to deduce scientifically and systematically what type of conscious experience it is having. Okay, so we're filling in the mathematical map, the objective map, with subjective conscious experience. And then we can then if we discover that, oh, a dog sees in this particular range of wavelengths of light, we can then even do things like we can make lenses, for example, that change our color perception. So we can even then say, modify our conscious experience of light such that we see in a way more similar to the way a dog sees. Or we might discover that dogs, we examine their rods and cones in their retinas, and we discover that dogs can't see. This is just an example off the top of my head. But let's say we investigate the eyes of a dog and we see, oh look, it can't see the color orange. Or it sees the color orange, it's colorblind in some way, and it sees the color orange. In fact, instead of seeing orange, it sees grey. Wherever there's orange, it sees grey, that particular wavelength of light, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting this is actually the case. It's just a possible example. I know nothing about dog eyesight. It's just an example that comes to mind. And then we have insight into the way a dog subjectively, consciously sees the world. Okay? And we can, but it has to expand outwards from human conscious experience, which makes a lot of sense. That's how physics has always worked. You know, our understanding of the universe as physicists and scientists began with Earth and the solar system. And our understanding of the universe has expanded outwards from, Euclid, let's say, studying just the space in terms of a flat plane, because we're on Earth and the Earth is very big, so we experience the surface of the Earth as a flat plane. That's where physics kind of started, really, with Euclid and the ancient Greeks. And now we expand outwards from the Earth and from the solar system, and our conception of the universe has got bigger and bigger and expanded outwards. And now we understand the universe on a much larger scale. But it begins with our experience on Earth. And it's the same with consciousness. our understanding of consciousness will begin with our understanding of human consciousness and the human physical form, and it will move outwards from there. But one thing that makes it much easier, one thing that makes our job as easier as scientists of consciousness is the fact that the more simple the conscious entity in question is, the easier it is to work out its conscious experience. Okay? So, for example, a dog or a chimpanzee is a much simpler creature than a human. And it has a much simpler, much less complex conscious life, intellectual life. So, if we study a dog carefully enough, its conscious life becomes we can understand pretty much all of its conscious motivations if we pay enough attention. Because and that is why we're able to understand that electrons and quantum particles are conscious, because they're so simple. We can see that they're just making simple choices between very limited sets of future states. Okay, but again, this all needs developing into the future. But the great thing is, these principles allow us to start this development. Whereas, if you'll notice, over the past few decades, there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of emergent theories put forward. And just not just emergent theories, but theories of consciousness. And none of them has led to anything. None of them has been capable of being developed into anything. They don't lead anywhere. Because you need the correct postulate in the first place, which is that energy is intrinsically conscious. So no new maths. The mathematical map, the objective mathematical map, has been drawn. And now the job of scientists of consciousness is to color in that map with subjective experience. So one good example is scientists now can objectively and very accurately draw a physical map of your body and brain. And then you'll have an exact physical map of all the positions of all the different parts of your body and brain. You know, you can watch the brain, and we can watch the neurons of our brain in real time using brain scanning techniques. And these brain scanning techniques are getting more and more accurate and more high resolution. So we have make more and more accurate objective models of the human body that we know, and then we will know that when we configure conscious energy and matter into those particular configurations, it gives rise to our human experience. And then a whole lot of neuroscience is, scanning people's brains while they have specific conscious experiences and correlating those specific conscious experiences to specific formations within the body and particularly within the brain. Okay, so that's one example of having a mathematical, objective, physical map of our human body, and then because we have conscious experience of being a human body, we can fill in the objective mathematical map with subjective conscious experience. Okay, so I hope you understand that. So no new maths. No, the maths has been done. Now there will be new maths in the future. Of course, there's still physics is by no means complete. General relativity still isn't compatible with quantum mechanics. I think the physics of consciousness is the solution to that. But yeah, as I say, I haven't worked out. I've worked out quantum mechanics, obviously, but I haven't quite cracked special relativity and general relativity there yet. And here's the funny thing. I have actually, I won't say I've cracked it, but I actually, in terms of conscious physics, I actually do understand general relativity, and it's actually special relativity I'm struggling with at the moment. But yeah, okay, so those are some objections, and now I was going to talk about some facts in favor of my theory. And yeah, relativity is another fact in favor of my theory. Because yeah, someone was mentioning localism, saying they didn't quite understand localism. So the principle of localism, where I said that consciousness is a local phenomenon, sorry. And that just means that conscious entities nearby one another affect each other's conscious states more than conscious entities far away from one another. Which, as I've said, this aligns with conventional physics, where nearby objects affect one another much more. The gravitational field of the Earth affects us, dominates our experience of gravity because we're very nearby the Earth. So, what localism means is that the nature and behavior of each part of our universe is determined by that same part of the universe. Okay? So, you're part of this universe, and you can determine the nature, the configuration of the universe that's around you. Like, I'm sitting here in my house, and I'm surrounded by chairs and objects and all these different things, and I can control the configuration of all these different objects. But I can only control things nearby me. I can't control the objects that are in your house. You get to decide on the configuration of the universe around you. And us humans, we don't have complete control. There are some things here that are too heavy for me to lift, for example. But we've evolved a lot, and we have a lot of different powers, and we have a lot of intelligence as humans. And it's this increasing intelligence that allows us to have more control over the configuration of the universe around us. But we already, as humans, have a lot of, look at the surface of the Earth, with all these buildings, skyscrapers, roads, etc. It's humans that consciously form the configuration of the surface of the Earth more than any other thing. The sun as well, and the weather systems. They have a lot of control as well, but we have an immense amount of control, and we've got to become aware of that and become much more responsible. Like, we have control of, we can change the surface of the Earth so that there's no Amazon rainforest, for example, which we've been doing for the past few decades, and we need to stop doing things like that. We need to become more conscious. I hope that the physics of consciousness leads to humans becoming much more conscious. But yeah, we can control the surface of the Earth, but we can't control the surface of Mars because it's far away. So that's what localism means. There's some examples of what it means when I say consciousness is a local phenomenon. And all physics is local. All physics is local. Gravity affects nearby things more than far away things. Light, the effect of light decreases with distance. Sounds get weaker the further you are away from their source. So in conventional objective physics, localism is a key principle, and in conscious physics as well. And this does lead us to time and space and relativity theories. And localism will be very important in those theories, because what Einstein was saying basically is that time is local. The passage of time is local. In Newton's theory, there was just the passage of time for the universe. There was just one clock for the whole universe. In Newton's theory, it's a good way of putting it. In Newton's theory, there's one big clock for the whole universe. One clock keeping time for the entire universe. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that Newton was saying there was any big clock, but he was just saying that time was the same for everyone, everywhere. In Newton's theory, time doesn't change if you accelerate, for example, or if you're in a gravitational field. In Einstein's theory, time changes for you if you accelerate, and time changes for you if you're in a gravitational field. But it does not change for just when time changes for you, it doesn't change for everyone else. It just changes for you locally. So what Einstein showed, really, what general relativity is all about, is that space and time are local. And again, this all coincides very nicely with my theory, where everything is conscious, so everything is having some conscious perception of the passage of time, and everything has some conscious perception of space, but it's all local, so you have conscious perception of the space around you only. And then the nature of the space around you affects your conscious perception of time as well. So as you probably know, if you're in a gravitational field, that will change how the rate at which time passes for you compared to someone outside of that field. But yeah, what I need to do, or what anyone, if people stopped, if people got involved with my theory and realized it was worth pursuing, and people could help me with these things, and we could work on the conscious theories of special and general relativity, which I'm working on. And as I say, general relativity is actually fine, but I am struggling at the moment to derive the Lorentz equations, which are the equations of special relativity. But yeah, as Einstein, the way Einstein developed his theory was by imagining that at each point in space there was an observer, a conscious observer, with a clock and a measuring rod. Now, did he actually, did the person need a clock and a measuring rod? No, he just meant someone counting time and experiencing space, measuring space. But there are many different, your heart is a clock, for example. You could, instead of an actual physical clock, you could use your heart rate. But anyway, someone at each point in space, he imagined someone consciously experiencing time and space. Now, according to my theory, all energy is conscious. All energy experiences time, and all energy experiences space. And consciousness is local, so your experience of time depends on the space local to you, and the gravitational fields that you're in, and the accelerations, the forces that you are experiencing. But yeah, that needs developing, And I hope people don't, the fact that I haven't completed these parts of my theory, I hope people don't see that as a weakness. It's just, I'm one person, and do understand Isaac Newton, for example, Isaac Newton didn't complete 1% of Newtonian physics. That's something important to understand. Isaac Newton gave the general principles and the most important laws. He gave the laws and the principles, and he did use those laws and principles to solve a number of problems and a number of systems, but very, very few relative to how many, that his principles were applied for centuries after he published them by thousands of different scientists and applied them to thousands of different systems, and they were developed. For example, the law of conservation of energy wasn't formulated by Newton. That came in the 1800s, I think. Newton came up with the law of conservation of momentum, but not energy. So yeah, the fact that I haven't completed relativity yet, I don't think you should hold that against my theory. In fact, I think the way that conceptually my theory aligns with relativity is actually further strong evidence in favor of my theory. Okay, so yeah, facts in favor of my theory. Okay, how do we believe in a theory? How do we trust? How can you trust that my principles are correct and that my theory is correct? Well, because of their explanatory power, and because they explain a wide range of different phenomena, and also testable hypotheses. I mentioned testable experiments as well, and I do have experiments that I'll release shortly when I feel that people are paying some attention, such that it's worth explaining my experiments. But yeah, I have I have one experiment in particular called Schrodinger's conscious cat, which I named obviously in honor of Schrodinger and his thought experiment. But this isn't my experiment. Isn't a thought experiment. It's a physical experiment that will show the connection between quantum mechanics and consciousness. It's a very interesting experiment. Anyway, so so there are experiments. That's one thing, but the other thing is explaining a wide range of phenomena. So let's look at the things that my theory explains. 1, solves the hard problem of consciousness, logically and simply. Gives the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. Great. That makes sense of our everyday experience as conscious entities. Aligns with our everyday experience of being physico-conscious entities who experience consciousness as if it's intrinsic to our physical form. Like, you're made out of energy and particles, and intrinsically within you, you're conscious. Makes a lot of sense, and that's throughout your entire body. Makes a lot of sense with respect to my theory, and there's no other theory that makes any sense. And I do encourage you to go and try and find any theory that does make sense. Because you can't. I mean, I've studied consciousness for decades, and there is no other... I don't have there's no competing theory, basically, that actually does anything. They're just, vague, very vague ideas. Like consciousness is integrated information. But you've got to say how. Information is formed out of energy. Any object that integrates information is also formed out of energy. So the integration of information is an energetic process between different forms of energy. Now, if you're saying that if energy is not intrinsically conscious, then you're just stuck with the hard problem again. Energy is not intrinsically conscious, so how when it's formed into information, and how when it's formed into a human brain, and they have this interaction, that's an interaction between energy, formations of energy. Now, how does non-conscious energy, how does it suddenly become conscious? You can't just say it's integrated information. It's just meaningless. Anyway, what else does my theory explain? Yeah, it allows for models. Okay, I am repeating myself a lot, but yeah. I mean, it's getting a bit ridiculous in a way to have done so much of this, to have shown such a wide range of explanatory power. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying my models are perfect. They're far from perfect because I'm not a neuroscientist. But for people not to be able to see that this is legit science and the power is, it's a bit strange, and it's a bit sad as well, because it's going to make for a renaissance in physics, and it has huge implications for medical science because of the placebo effect. There's another thing that my theory explains immediately: the effect of our thoughts on our physical health. Makes perfect sense. If our brains are all conscious energy and our bodies are all conscious energy and they're connected to one another, then our different thoughts have different are different configurations of physical energy, and so different configurations will have different effects on our body, because our brain is connected to the rest of our body by our nervous system. So that immediately makes sense if all energy is conscious. The placebo effect, and that can be developed. I have ways of using my principles and stuff to develop the placebo effect, so it becomes much, much more powerful. And the placebo effect can be developed further and further to work with more and more different diseases and have more of a potent effect as a tool in medicine. Okay. So yeah, the last thing I said was, point 6 here is psychology, stiff-mindedness. So yeah, the real problem is that scientists have been thinking in one way for such a long time. And that one way that they've been thinking is, energy and particles are totally devoid of any consciousness, and the universe hasn't had any consciousness for billions of years, and consciousness has just suddenly switched on Earth and maybe on other planets, but only after 10 billion years. And it somehow switches on around non-conscious energy and particles. But this is just pure anthropocentrism. Okay, we look at a star and we think, well, that's nothing like us. That doesn't behave like we behave. It just kind of sits there in space, so it must not be conscious. But that's because we have this tendency to only be able to view existence from our own perspective, very naturally, because that's the only perspective we have. And the only experience of consciousness we have is human consciousness. So then we naturally tend to assume that human consciousness is the only consciousness that exists. But slowly but surely, as we've studied the world around us more carefully, more attentively, the set of things that we believe to be conscious has expanded and expanded. So not very long ago, scientists didn't think that that animals were conscious. A lot of scientists didn't think that animals were conscious. Now we know that animals are conscious. No one doubts that their dog is conscious. Now we realize that plants are conscious, and that fungi are conscious, and that the bacteria in your stomach are conscious. And this set of things that we believe to be conscious has expanded now to include everything, all energy, all basic particles, as you can see from my essay on quantum mechanics. So yeah, but these scientists, the members of the establishment are used to not, they're not used to thinking like that at all. They've spent their whole life assuming that energy is conscious, energy and particles are non-conscious, and trying to work out how does the consciousness switch on. So they've been thinking that like their minds, their brains have stiffened into just only seeing the universe that one way. So that's what I'm really fighting against, is kind of it's such a new way of thinking. And also, I also present it to scientists of consciousness who have their own theories, and they're professionally invested in their theories because they've published their theories, and their careers depend on their theories, and then that whole publish or perish thing. So my theory and my definition of consciousness invalidates all the other theories, which is one reason why obviously they won't want me to get any attention. But anyway, so that's why I'd encourage you, if you do understand the theory and you can see its power, I'd love to collaborate. If you have any good ideas, if you see any interesting applications, and definitely share it with other people who you think will be interested who are interested in consciousness and understanding consciousness. It would be great if we get this out into the zeitgeist and start developing it and taking advantage of its power, Because the more accurate our scientific understanding of reality is, the more powerful we are as humans. Like Newton made us vastly more powerful creatures because we understood the universe around us so much more accurately. Like, it is entirely thanks to Isaac Newton that humans landed on the moon. The calculations that NASA did to land on the moon didn't involve any general relativity at all, just Newton's law of gravity and his laws of motion. So Newton made us so powerful that we were able to land on the moon. And the physics of consciousness will make us powerful in many other ways. And in particular, I think it will have a very revolutionary effect on medicine and, developing much less invasive and destructive ways of curing disease. Again, it will take time to develop these things, but there's a huge amount of promise there, which I think is the main reason we should start taking these things seriously and give them the attention they deserve and start working on them within this scientific establishment. Okay, so that's that. Those are just me addressing some common objections as best I can. In my next lecture, I'm going to read out the scientific definition of consciousness and comment on it. Okay, and then I've got a few other things I want to publish. One essay on geometrical epistemology. That's the idea that our beliefs are grounded in physical formations of neurons in our brains. And that we will someday start to understand the formations, the neurological formations of our brains that give rise to our thoughts. Okay, so we'll be able to read when a person does maths. For example, when a person does a mathematical calculation, once the resolution of our brain scanners increases enough, we'll be able to read the maths in the language of the neurons of their brain as they perform the calculation, which is very exciting for the future. So I want to write that essay. That's called Geometrical Epistemology, and then an essay where I explain the testable hypotheses that I have to corroborate my theory. So like, share, and subscribe. Anyone you know interested in consciousness or science, please share these ideas with them, share these lectures with them. If they don't understand, maybe you can explain it to them. And any comments or doubts or ideas that you have related to these ideas, please let me know in the comments below. Thanks for listening. Hope you got something out of it. Okay, thanks. Take care. All the best.